What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be breaking down all of the main card fights from a betting perspective that take place at UFC 287 this weekend. I want to kick things off by saying a big shout out to Corey Sandhagen, who came through for us in a big way on the last event. And if you appreciated that winner, please hit the like button below. You'd be amazed how much of a difference it makes to how many views these videos get. Generally speaking, the more likes I get, the more views I get, because YouTube just pushes the video out to more people. So we hit a nice winner on Sandhagen on the last event. So if you appreciate that, please hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and hopefully we can dig up some more winners in this video today, because I do have at least one bet to share with you, and we'll talk about some other bets that I am considering on the other fights we're going to be discussing today. If you like these breakdowns, don't forget that you can also get breakdowns for all of the prelim matchups on this card over on my website, MMABettingTips.com. You'll find a link for that in the description below. You can see it in the background here. So today we're going to be breaking down the main card fights. My website is where you'll find strategy guides in the form of videos for all those prelim matchups. And as ever, please remember to gamble responsibly. It is brutally difficult to make money betting on sports. As we say on every single one of these videos, the perception online is that everyone makes money betting on sports. You go on Twitter, everyone seems to be profitable. You look on Instagram, you've got all these professional gamblers in Gucci tracksuits, diamond chains, chilling in hotel rooms with big briefcases full of money, driving around in Bentleys. It's not like that. It's absolutely not like that. In order to make money in this game, I'm literally chained to my desk for 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. It is absolutely brutal. It is extremely tough. So if you're not putting in that level of work, very unlikely you will be profitable. So remember, very important, that gambling is really difficult, really hard, and you need to do your own research. Everything I say in this video is based on my research, but I'm not telling you what to do. This for entertainment purposes only. Go do your own research, see if you agree. So we're going to kick things off by breaking down the main event of this weekend's card, which is going to be Alex Pereira against Israel Adesanya. And this is an interesting fight from a betting point of view, because I am going to recommend a bet on this fight. Or recommend's not the right word, right? You've got to do your own research and figure things out for yourself. But I'm going to be betting this fight, and I'm going to be sharing with you who I'm going to bet on. But this is one of those bets that I don't like very much. This is one of those bets where the odds have kind of forced my hand. The odds are forcing me to place the bet. It's one of those bets where I say you've got to let the odds do the work for you. So in recent months, I've shared quite a lot of winners with you guys, right? If you look at the title of the last video, Sandhagen is a great bet. Sandhagen won fairly easily against Marlon Vera. We've got another one here. Tommy Fury will beat Jake Paul. You see it in the thumbnail. Obviously, Tommy Fury did beat Jake Paul at underdog odds. He was a very nice winner. And if we scroll down just a little bit further, we can see here this thumbnail. Jamal Hill is a great bet. And in the title, Jamal Hill is a great bet. And obviously, Jamal Hill beat Glover to win the title. So we've been sharing these bets on these high-profile fights in recent months, and we're doing really well. But I was extremely confident that Sandhagen, Tommy Fury, and Jamal Hill would win. If you go back, watch the breakdowns for each of those fights, it was quite clear that all three of those guys had huge advantages over their opponents. And, there was a decent amount of value in the odds. I am going to bet Israel Adesanya this weekend, but it's one of those bets where I feel nowhere near as confident as the other bets that we've had in the last few months. And so I would just really recommend do your own research on this one. So we're going to break down the Israel Adesanya Alex Pereira fight from a betting point of view now. And like I say, I am recommending is not the right word. I am going to be betting Israel Adesanya, but it is purely one of those bets where I'm letting the odds do the work for me. So, the beauty of this matchup is that it's a handicapper's dream, because what we normally have to do is go and take a look at Alex Pereira's recent fights, go take a look at Israel Adesanya's recent fights, and then try and visualize and solve the puzzle of how both guys are going to match up stylistically, how the strengths and weaknesses of both guys are likely to play out. You know, whose weaknesses are going to cost them more, whose strengths are going to be the deciding factor in the fight. But when you've got a situation like this where, you know, not that long ago these two guys actually fought each other, it's a handicapper's dream, because it is literally, I mean, the work is done for us. We know exactly how they match up stylistically. We know exactly how, you know, the strengths and weaknesses of both guys are going to impact the matchup, because we've already seen it. You know, we saw it 5 months ago. And so this is, I think, an easy fight for betting, in the sense that seeing these two go up against one another 5 months ago gives us a lot of clarity. There's very little ambiguity here. There's very little to speculate on and predict. Like, it is what it is. It's very black and white. It's very clear cut. And so if you are going to be betting this fight this weekend, I would strongly recommend just taking 25 minutes out of your day to go and watch their first fight, because it will really pay dividends. It will enable you to cut through all the bullshit, cut through all the hype, cut through all the UFC promotional material, cut through all the fighter interviews and press conferences, and you'll find the truth. The footage is the only place where you'll find truth and honesty in this game. The footage will set you free. So go spend 25 minutes doing that, and it'll put you ahead of probably 95% of people sharing opinions on this fight, who are working from hazy memories, who, you know, watched the fight 5 months ago and have like a perception of what happened without actually going back and watching it and analysing it closely to figure out what is actually true. And this is super important, because when I watched the fight live, I'd kind of somehow forgotten how easy the fight was for Adesanya. And so when I sat down to research this matchup this week, I didn't really have an opinion on it. I wasn't like leaning too heavily either way. I didn't plan to bet this fight. And when I rewatched that matchup from back in November, I was kind of blown away by how one-sided it was. It caught me by surprise. And so, for that reason, there is just no way that I can pass on Israel Adesanya. I have to bet him. But in this breakdown, we're going to be talking about reasons why I don't love a bet on Izzy. I loved bets on Tommy Fury and Corey Sandhagen and Jamal Hill. I loved those bets. I was super confident in all three guys. I don't love this bet, but the odds forced my hand. This is one of those fights where you've really got to let the odds do the work for you. Let me explain. So if we take a look at the odds, we can see that Izzy is currently around an average of, say, 1.74, which is minus 135 for an implied probability of 57%. If we take a look at the odds on Pereira, he's around an average of, call it 2.15, which is going to be plus 115 for an implied probability of 47%. So as you can see, these odds are in the even money odds range, which is kind of crazy when you take into consideration the fact that Izzy, for the most part, dominated the first fight. He beat Alex Pereira in basically every single aspect of MMA. He out-grappled him. He outstruck him. He was never really in any danger. You know, we talk a lot about Pereira's power and how dangerous he is, but it wasn't until the 5th round where Pereira actually managed to hurt Izzy. It was actually Izzy that knocking Pereira out, you know, very early on in the fight. So this is one of those situations where when you go and watch how their first fight played out and how dominant Izzy was, the fact that these two are in the even money odds range is kind of insane. Because if Izzy can just avoid getting knocked out here, what the first fight showed, or what keep saying what the first fight. What the first fight in MMA showed us was that Pereira cannot match Izzy in terms of volume. He cannot out-grapple Izzy either. And so Pereira's only real path to victory, and again, this can always change, but Pereira's only path to victory based on their first fight in MMA is to win by knockout. And like Chael Sonnen famously said, when you try and win a fight by knockout, you often end up losing a decision, because in the process of waiting for that perfect shot to land and looking for that knockout, you're losing rounds because you're getting outworked. And this was really the story with their first fight in MMA, where Pereira was just stalking Izzy around the cage, but not really landing very much, and Izzy was just racking up major volume. So Izzy was just putting round after round after round in the bank, and Pereira had backed himself into a corner where by the 5th round he needed a finish in order to win. He went out there and got it, but he was kind of lucky in the sense that, you know, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Marc Goddard, and, you know, I can't imagine how difficult it must be to have the clarity of mind to make good decisions in the heat of the moment, you know, in a high stakes UFC fight where the crowd are going crazy and there's so much to consider. Having said that, I do think it was a bit of an early stoppage. I also don't think Izzy was hurt that bad. I also think, you know, when Pereira was kind of unloading on Izzy up against the cage, if Izzy would have just flopped to his back Fabrizio Verdum style or Ryan Hall style or Paul Craig style, I think he would have survived to the end of round 5 and won a decision. So it was just a sequence of unfortunate events in round 5 that went against Izzy, and a sequence of a lot of luck, which kind of went in Pereira's favour. But does lightning strike twice? And does Pereira get as lucky again? Who knows? Who knows? But when you go back and watch the first fight, it is so one-sided for pretty much the entire matchup that it's just impossible for me to pass on Izzy. It's just a no-brainer. Like, he fucking dominated their first fight in MMA. Threw a leg kick, hurt himself in round 5. Pereira went in for the kill, got the finish. But, you know, there was a lot that went Pereira's way in that 5th round. He did get kind of lucky. And now we're being presented with an opportunity to bet the far superior mixed martial arts fighter in the even money odds range, which is crazy. You've got to respect how dangerous Pereira is, and there are risk factors with Izzy, which we will talk about. But having said that, I would still cap Izzy at like 1.4 minus 250, 1.5 minus 200 in this fight. I wouldn't have Izzy as a massive favourite because you've got to respect the threats that Pereira brings to the table, but he was outclassed. Let's call an egg an egg. He was outclassed, and if Izzy can just avoid slipping on a banana skin, I think he'll win this rematch pretty comfortably. But at the very beginning of this breakdown, I did talk about the fact that I absolutely loved our bets on Sandhagen, Tommy Fury, and Jamal Hill, and I do not love our bet on Israel Adesanya. And the only reason why I'm placing the bet on Izzy is because of the odds. I do not feel confident in Izzy at all going into this fight, but the odds are forcing my hand. You can't be a dum-dum, right? You can't be a dum-dum. You gotta let the odds do the work for you. I'm just letting the odds do the work for me on this one. So we're going to talk about more of the reasons why I think Izzy will win this fight from a technical point of view in a moment. But we now need to talk about the reasons why I really don't like this bet on Izzy. So if we look at the tail of the tape, to the naked eye, there's nothing major going on. Izzy's 33 years old, 6'4" with an 80-inch reach. Pereira, 35 years old, 6'4" with an 80-inch reach. So on paper, looks like both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size. We know that's not really the case. Even though Pereira is, you know, a similar size to Izzy, there's a big difference in physicality when it comes to striking. Pereira is far more physically imposing, far more powerful. However, Izzy is far more technical and far quicker than Pereira. What is also kind of interesting about this matchup, though, is that a fighter's physicality usually transcends to all aspects of the fight. And Pereira's quite unique in the sense that he's very powerful and very physically imposing when it comes to striking, but he's quite weak on the ground. He doesn't have a whole lot of physicality to his grappling, which I thought is interesting because, Pereira's got that big, physically imposing muscular frame. Izzy is quite slight and lean, yet Izzy was able to kind of overwhelm Pereira with physicality on the ground, which I found super interesting actually. So that's something to just bear in mind. But even though they're roughly the same size, both guys are strikers. You'd expect there to be a lot of striking in this matchup, and Pereira obviously gets the nod for physicality and power. The main reason why I am worried about betting Israel Adesanya this weekend, though, is just because of a trend that I've noticed over the years. So I make a living from live betting on the UFC, and I've made a lot of money over the last 14 years since I started live betting the UFC. And I would say for like most of those 14 years, most of the last 14 years, I've probably watched like at least, I would say most weeks in the last 14 years I've watched at least 30 hours of MMA. And when you watch that much MMA, you kind of become a bit of a wise owl and a bit of a dinosaur. I'm 38 years old now. And you just kind of start to sense things that cannot be explained by numbers or statistics or tangible things. You just get like a sixth sense for things. You just get like an intuition, right? What they say, like women's intuition, right? You just kind of get a sense for things. And what I've noticed anecdotally over the last 14 years is when guys achieve a lot of success in the UFC and they start rocking up to press conferences in big diamond watches and big diamond necklaces, and when they do that shot of fighters arriving in the arena for the fight night and they're in like fur coats or head to toe in Gucci tracksuits or like fancy sunglasses, right? When I see that happen, it's always the beginning of the end. Almost always the beginning of the end. And we can go through some recent examples of this, right? Max Holloway. When Max Holloway was on the come up, he was this young, hungry bull. He was just an absolute dog that would look to outwork people. And then he got the title, and then he started, rocking up to press conferences in like fancy designer clothes and the fur bucket hat. And then almost to the fucking day that started to happen, Holloway's career fell off a cliff. Another example would be Davison Figueiredo, right? Figueiredo was this fucking berserker who would come out the gate hard, super aggressive, get into these wars, like knock guys 12 feet across the octagon. Devastating power. He was a marauder. No one could handle Figueiredo in the flyweight division. And then he got the title, and then he started showing up to press conferences with big diamond Rolexes and Gucci sweaters, and his career fell off a cliff. And then the more recent example is Kamaru Usman, one of the best examples. Usman went on this insane winning streak. And Usman is, Usman's a very unique example because when Usman was on his title run and got the belt, no one really tested him, right? It wasn't until the Colby fight, the first Colby fight, where we actually saw someone test Usman and drag him into a competitive matchup. Before that, he was so dominant, so one-sided. Every single one of his fights was one-sided, just used to shut everyone out. And I remember, I can't remember what fight it was, but I remember watching Usman rock up to the arena for one of his fights, and he was in like some fucking bright red shirt and a giant fur coat and like a fancy hat and some like gold shades, and I was like, oh, here we go, it's the beginning of the end. And you've seen that with Izzy. You've seen him with a big old diamond Rolex, you've seen him with the pearls on, you've seen him with the fur coats. And what I can say is, it's always the beginning of the end. It always is. I'm a dinosaur. I'm an old man. I've been doing this a long time. I'm a wise old fox, as they say in the UK. And I've just seen this cycle play out over and over and over and over and over and over again. And that's one of those things where, from a betting point of view, it complicates things a lot. Because you have two different approaches. Your logical brain wants to work at... your logical brain wants to look at, their first fight in MMA. And if we're being brutally honest, there'll be some people that will disagree with me in the comments. They're fine and entitled to their opinion. But the first fight was very one-sided. Izzy was cruising until he threw that leg kick in round 5 to kind of hurt himself. And then Pereira went in for the kill. It was very one-sided. So your logical brain wants to look at that first fight and bet Israel Adesanya in the even money odds range, and it's an absolute no-brainer. But then that fucking experience I have of doing this for such a long time plants that seed of doubt where I'm like, is a guy that wears a fucking pearl necklace and a diamond watch really capable of going in there and beating this Brazilian savage with dynamite in his hands, insane motivation, drive, will to win, and a guy that is absolutely tough as fucking nails? And on top of that, he's going to have learnt a lot from his first fight against Izzy. He's going to be a lot more experienced now. He'd never been 5 rounds before in MMA. He's going to know how to pace himself better. He's felt Izzy out, for almost 25 minutes. He knows what to expect from Izzy now. He'll be much better prepared. What can Izzy do differently this time? I would expect to see much greater improvements from Pereira than I would from Izzy. Izzy is, in terms of MMA, at 33 years old, you wouldn't expect him to be improving that much from fight to fight with so many MMA fights under his belt. Pereira has only had 8 pro fights, so even though he's 35 years old, he's still going to be learning and improving at a much faster rate than Izzy is. So it's one of those situations where my logical mind is telling me Izzy is an absolute no-brainer because of how comfortable and one-sided the first fight was for him. But everything else outside of how they match up technically points towards Pereira winning. So this is one of those bets where I have to bet Izzy because I'm not an idiot, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see him lose because there are a lot of anecdotally strong trends going against him this weekend. If we talk about how they match up stylistically, I mentioned earlier on in the breakdown how Pereira's lack of physicality on the ground really surprised me. I think this is an area where Izzy can have a lot of success in this fight because it was quite clear in that first matchup that Izzy had a big advantage on the ground. I think if Izzy used more grappling in this fight, it would be a double-edged sword because, well, it would be a triple-edged sword actually. It would help him in 3 ways. First way it would help him is, well, he'd obviously be winning rounds because Pereira is pretty easy to take down and control. So that's the first way that using more grappling would help him. The second way, don't mean to give you guys the middle finger, I'm just fucking counting over here. The second way it would help Izzy if he used more grappling is that the more time you spend grappling, the less time you have to spend stood in front of this fucking guy that can end your life with 1 punch. So by grappling more, you spend less time striking against this guy, which is where Pereira wants to be, which is where he's at his best. The third way in which a more grappling heavy game plan would benefit Izzy is that Pereira is a big dude. Big, heavy, clunky dude. And the more you force him to grapple, the more you'll tire him out, which means the less dangerous he'll be on the feet. So I think with how dominant Izzy was on the ground in their first fight, a tweak that Izzy could make to his game plan in this matchup would be more grappling. I think that would be very smart. That's one of the reasons why I like Izzy in this fight a lot. Second thing we saw was that Pereira cannot match Izzy's volume. Izzy was able to outstrike him by a wide margin. It wasn't even close. Izzy just chipped away at him for 5 rounds, racked up big volume, and Izzy is also a lot faster as well. I will also say this. Aside from the odd 1, 2, maybe 3 moments max in their first fight, Pereira didn't get near Izzy. Didn't pull the trigger. Didn't put Izzy in any danger. Now, Pereira could be a lot more aggressive in this fight. Could take a lot of confidence now from the first matchup, now that he knows how to pace himself over 5 rounds. But at the same time, the speed, the footwork of Izzy made life extremely difficult for Pereira, because Izzy fights and moves like someone in a much lower weight class, whereas Pereira fights like someone in a heavier weight class. He's a big, slow, clunky middleweight. Izzy is a lightning fast, quick middleweight. So they are opposite ends of that scale, despite being the same size on paper. And so Izzy's got a big advantage on the ground. If it stays standing, Pereira probably needs a knockout in order to win. For those reasons, I like Izzy in this fight, but it is one of my less confident bets. Take from that what you will, man. Do your own research. Okay, now in terms of the over-under, what does this mean? So, personally, I don't lean that strongly either way on this fight to go to a decision or not, which probably means the odds being in the even money odds range is accurate. I am not going to be betting on the over-under on this matchup. If you want to bet the over-under, I do slightly prefer the under, purely because in the first fight, Izzy wobbled Pereira bad early on and was very close to knocking him out. And we know Pereira's got devastating knockout power in his hands. So both guys are super dangerous. 25 minutes is a long ass fucking time for neither of these dudes to get put away. So with that being said, I do slightly lean towards the fight not to go to decision, but I don't love it and I won't be betting it myself. Now in terms of the props on this one, how do we feel about the props? Let me know in the comments below if you've got any props you like. There aren't any props that I love on this fight either. I think the most likely outcome is Izzy by decision. The odds are pretty tight on that though. Pretty bad odds. Don't really like the props on this matchup. Nothing's really jumping out at me. I would probably give them a pass. So I hope you found that useful. We will now move on to breaking down the next fight between Gilbert Burns and Jorge Gamebred Masvidal. So let's start off by taking a look at the odds on this one. So Gilbert Burns, one of the biggest favourites on the card, average odds of around 1.22, which is going to be minus 455 for an implied probability of 82%. We take a look at the odds on Masvidal. He's around an average of 4.50, which is going to be plus 350 for an implied probability of 22%. So Burns is 36 years old, 5'10" with a 71-inch reach, but he will be 37 very soon. Masvidal, 38 years old, 5'11" with a 74-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size. Burns a little bit younger, Masvidal slightly longer reach, but nothing major in terms of X factor other than the fact that Masvidal has a boatload of miles on the clock, with over 50 pro fights, which is a lot for someone in the lighter weight classes. And I think we are seeing Masvidal on a pretty steep decline. With Burns being almost 37 years old, there's no doubt that he's going to be declining a lot as well from fight to fight. Father Time's undefeated. It's inevitable. However, I think the difference between these two is Burns hasn't really shown any signs of major decline yet, whereas I feel Masvidal has. He did look a little shot in the Colby fight. Reflexes looked very off in his last, 2 matchups against Usman and Covington. Masvidal went his whole career without getting knocked out, and then was brutally knocked out in the second round against Usman. When stuff like that starts to happen, the reflexes start to go, guys start to get knocked out that don't usually start to get knocked out. It's almost always the beginning of the end. And another thing that I saw this week, thanks to Hiltzy, we go to the VIP chat room. Hiltzy posted something earlier, and here it is, where Masvidal has said that this could be his last fight, and he might quit if he loses, which is obviously a huge red flag, because again, in the Izzy versus Pereira breakdown, we're talking about, you know, anecdotal trends to be aware of. When a fighter mentions retirement or mentions it being the end of the road for them, they almost always lose. Like, it almost always, like the win rate on fighters who say they may retire and then take a fight is probably like 1 in 10. Like, you never see him win. So the fact that that's on Masvidal's radar, the fact that he's even thinking about it, is a sign that it is probably the beginning of the end for Masvidal. And so there's no way that I would bet him this weekend. Which is interesting, because when you look at the odds on this matchup, with how big of a favourite Burns is, I don't think it's a terrible fight for Masvidal. But obviously, you know, him mentioning retirement makes it extremely difficult to bet him. But if we talk about the reasons why this isn't a terrible fight for him, we go through them, right? So straight away, we can see that he's going to have home advantage on his side. You know, the crowd are going to be behind Masvidal big time with, you know, with him. I'm not sure if he's actually from Miami, but he actually is, yeah, born in Miami, Florida. I know that, you know, he's got a strong affinity to Miami. And so the crowd are going to be behind him in a big way. He's going to have home advantage. We know the judges in Florida are historically extremely bad. Home advantage is going to be a big thing in the eyes of the judges. So if Masvidal can make this fight remotely close, that could pay dividends. And on top of that, there are a lot of weaknesses in Gilbert Burns' skill set that Masvidal can potentially exploit. So we know that Burns is a very good MMA grappler, good offensive wrestling, very high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And we know that, you know, grappling has been Masvidal's biggest weakness throughout his career, right? His takedown offense isn't great, his ground game isn't great. But what makes this dynamic interesting when it comes to grappling is Burns is one of these guys that is cursed in many ways, because he has this really high-level grappling, but he doesn't have the gas tank to use it. Burns is one of these guys that if he grapples, he actually burns himself out pretty quick. And a good example of this would be his fight against Stephen Thompson, where he was able to win that fight very comfortably using his grappling, but he had to be very calculated in when he used it. He took long periods off in the fight where he would avoid engaging to then conserve enough energy to commit really hard to his grappling and steal rounds with takedowns. So what's interesting about that is Masvidal's takedown offense isn't great. His ground game isn't great, but he can make you work hard for takedowns, and he's not terrible at working his way back up to his feet. Masvidal is one of these guys that at times hesitates and doesn't show enough urgency to work his way back up to his feet, but he knows how. And if Burns does plan on using grappling in this fight, I do think Masvidal can have a reasonable amount of success defending himself from the threat of Burns' grappling, which will force Burns to burn through a lot of energy, which could potentially make Burns less effective on the feet, which is where this fight could get interesting, because both of these guys have very different styles of striking, where Burns likes to use footwork and movement to stay outside the range where he can be hit, but for the most part will just load up on big singular power shots. You don't see a lot of volume from Burns, you don't see a lot of combinations. Masvidal is the opposite. You don't see a tremendous amount of footwork and movement from Masvidal, but you do see a lot of volume and you do see a lot of combinations. And so if Masvidal can find a way to turn this fight into a war in the same way that, you know, we saw Burns get into a war against Chimaev, and Masvidal doesn't get himself knocked out, I could see a situation here where this fight is contested at a crazy pace, which causes Burns to slow a little bit, Masvidal's gas tank holds up better, and then Masvidal's volume striking enables him to outwork Gilbert Burns. And with the crowd behind Masvidal, the crowd going crazy, you know, the judges on Masvidal's side, things could get interesting. It's one of those matchups where early on, I do expect Gilbert Burns to do really well, because I think his footwork and movement is going to be too good for Masvidal to get near him. I think he's going to be able to frustrate Masvidal with his footwork and movement. and he's a lot more powerful than Masvidal. So with Masvidal's reflexes being shot at this stage in his career, I could see Burns catching him with a big shot and putting him away. Burns has also got his grappling to fall back on. So there's no doubt that Burns deserves to be a big favourite in this fight. I'm not saying I like Masvidal in this matchup, but what I am saying is there are, I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit and saying, look, there are things that Masvidal can do to make this one interesting. Not like Masvidal's dead in the water here. And so it will be interesting to see how this one plays out. Again, you've got to let the odds do the work for you. I think there's enough risk factors here with Burns that you'd be crazy to bet him at these odds. Very little upside to betting Burns at these odds. But at the same time, with Masvidal looking shot in his last 2 fights, talking about retirement, Burns having a big advantage on the ground over him, as well as Burns being, dangerous on the feet, having knockout power. Masvidal being knocked out by Usman. I don't feel like it's smart to take a shot on Masvidal either, but I do think Masvidal could make this fight interesting. If this fight were in the Apex Center with nobody watching, I'd feel a lot more confident in Burns, but I think the Miami factor, the hometown advantage factor, I think that adds a layer of I think it adds something quite interesting to this fight. So in terms of the over-under on this one, I do think this fight is quite likely to go to a decision. And so the fight goes to a decision at underdog odds, 2.25 plus 125. That is interesting to me. I don't know if I will bet it yet, but that is interesting to me. And it's interesting because both guys are tough as nails. Neither of them have got any quit in them. It's not easy to put either of them away. We saw Burns go toe-to-toe with Chimaev in his last fight. That was an absolute war. He's gone the distance with, Stephen Thompson. Distance with Tyron Woodley. A good amount of, Burns' fights do go to a decision. If you look at Masvidal's record, same story over here, right? Decision. This fight went deep. Decision. Both guys are extremely tough. Both guys are extremely difficult to put away. And both guys are pretty good defensively as well. Burns' footwork and movement makes him difficult to hit. Masvidal stays behind the high boxing guard. And even though Burns got a big advantage on the ground, Masvidal's defensive wrestling and submission defense is pretty good. And if we're being realistic, if Burns failed to submit a guy like Stephen Thompson, probably not that likely he's going to submit Masvidal, because Masvidal's submission defense, wrestling defense is a lot better than Thompson's, if we're being brutally honest. So, from a betting point of view, this fight is a bit dead. The fight goes to decision is interesting to me. Not sure if I'll bet it yet. In terms of prop bets, they're all a bit dead, if I'm being honest. You guys know my approach with prop bets. I like to go for high risk, high reward props. So the most likely outcome on this fight is probably something like Burns by decision, but the odds are terrible. And so I would be looking at props which have a lot more risk but a lot better reward as well. So one prop that interests me would be Masvidal by decision. Odds are 10.0 plus 900. It's got an implied probability of about 10%. That's interesting to me because, like I said, Masvidal does have home advantage. Burns does have a tendency to adrenaline dump and gas out and slow down. We know the Florida judges are extremely bad. Even if Burns wins the fight, the judges may still take it from him. And with Masvidal having home advantage, reasonably good, submission defense, reasonably good takedown defense, reasonably good ability to work his way back at his feet, a higher volume striker than Burns, those odds just seem interesting to me. It's probably not going to be something I'm going to bet myself. I don't like props, but if you do like betting props, sprinkling a little bit of money on every fight to make watching the fights more interesting, I think that is an interesting one to go for. Now, let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Adrian Yanez against Rob Font. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Yanez is the favourite at average odds of around 1.54, which is going to be minus 185 for an implied probability of 65%. If we take a look at the odds on Font, he's around an average of 2.50, which is going to be plus 150 for an implied probability of 40%. So bookies have got this roughly 60-40 in favour of Yanez. And if we look at the tail of the tape, we can see Yanez is 29 years old, 5'7", with a 70-inch reach. And we can see that Rob Font is 35 years old, 5'8", with a 71.5-inch reach. So we can see that Yanez is 6 years younger, both guys roughly about the same size. Statistically, though, age is quite an interesting factor to take into consideration on this one, because we know that the lighter weight classes are all about speed, reflexes and athleticism. So Font is going to be 36 years old in a couple of months' time, which is very, very old for a bantamweight. And 36 years old for a bantamweight is probably the equivalent of like late 30s in the middleweight or light heavyweight division. You know, Father Time tends to hit guys in the lighter weight classes at earlier ages than the heavier weight classes. So Font is quite old now. He has had a lot of fights, 25 pro fights. He's been in a lot of wars. There's a lot of miles on the clock. He's suffered a lot of damage throughout his career. And we know that Yanez is this young, hungry bull. Nowhere near as many fights. Well, actually, it's not a big difference in terms of experience, but there is a big difference in the wear and tear Yanez has put on his body compared to Font, with Font competing against the highest level of bantamweights over the last sort of 5 years in the UFC. Yanez still on the come up, hasn't been in as many wars, hasn't put as many miles on the clock. So that 6-year age gap is really meaningful in this one, because statistically the younger fighter wins around 65% of the time when there's a 6-year age gap in a fight, which is interesting because, well, if you look at the implied probability on Yanez's odds, 65%. So if you're just blind betting on that age statistic, these odds are exactly where they should be. But what's interesting about the age statistic is what the age really shows, or what those age statistics really show, is that young hungry bulls beat aging veterans whose bodies are beat up more often than not. But there's also a sweet spot to it where the meaningfulness and the usefulness of that statistic is absolutely at its peak, right? And this is an example of one of those situations where you've got Rob Font, who is very old now for a bantamweight, and Yanez, who is in his prime. So it's kind of like the extreme end of the scale where this stat is absolutely at its most meaningful, compared to if we had, for example, a 6-year age gap with someone that was 33 years old or 32 years old fighting someone that was 26 years old. The stat isn't as useful when applied in those situations, because the guy that's 32 hasn't really started to decline yet, and the guy that's 26 is still green and improving. So this is where these stats can really be useful. At the end of the day, stats are useful, but they're only useful when interpreted in the correct way. And this fight is a good example of how those stats can become very valuable to pay attention to. But what is interesting about this fight is that I do think that Rob Font is significantly better than Adrian Yanez in every single aspect of MMA. Yanez is an exciting fighter who is very likable, is great to watch, and has got a lot of popularity in the sport. And this is obviously a passing of the guard type fight where the UFC are kind of using Rob Font as a gatekeeper to see if Yanez is ready to take that step into that title picture. But when you look at Yanez's recent performances, they have not been good. When he first came into the UFC, he was very technical. He moved very well, fast hands, showed a diverse range of strikes, brilliant combinations. He was a nightmare on the feet. But we can't ignore the fact that He's kind of been outstruck in 2 of his last 3. I think this was a bad decision. I watched this, when I watched the fight live, I scored it 29-28 for Davy Grant. I rewatched it this week. I still feel it was a robbery. I think, Grant won that fight 29-28. I think the reason why the judges scored that fight for Yanez was because Grant was wearing a lot of visible damage on his face, which Yanez was able to inflict off the jab. But I feel the mistake the judges made in that fight was that most of that damage was sustained in 1 round. So you score that damage based on that round. But I feel that that damage then went against Grant in the other rounds, even though Yanez didn't do that much damage in those rounds, if that made sense. It's just Grant looked bad because he was busted up quite bad. So I do think that was a bad decision. So, if you go back and watch the Randy Costa fight, Costa jabbed Yanez's face off, outstruck him pretty comfortably. Yanez was damaged pretty bad in that one before Costa gassed out and faded in round 2. And then I feel he lost the Davy Grant fight. So I do feel this is a massive step up in competition for Yanez. I feel like Yanez may be one of these guys that looks great against lower level of opponents, where he can kind of overwhelm them and style on them with his superior technique. But as he starts to face that step up, he's really starting to struggle. And we know Rob Font is a very, very good striker, very good boxer, moves well, very technical, decent gas tank. He beat the brakes off Marlon Vera when they fought. It was just, Vera kept finding ways to knock him down. But outside of that, I would say that Font was actually more successful on the feet against Vera than Sandhagen was, which is crazy to say. But what cost Font in that fight was that he kept getting knocked down. And this takes us back to the point we were making about Father Time, potentially hitting Font pretty hard at this stage in his career, where perhaps his chin is starting to go, perhaps he can't take a shot like he used to, because he kept getting dropped against Marlon Vera. He outstruck Vera pretty comfortably, but just kept getting caught. And that's what makes it very difficult to bet on Font in this fight, because even though I do believe Font is better than Yanez in every single aspect of MMA, I think he's a much better striker, I think he's better defensively, I think he moves better. We don't know a lot about Yanez's grappling, but you'd expect Font to have the edge there too, with him being more experienced. The problem I've got is Yanez has shown that he's very tough, he's very durable, he fights at a high pace, and he's very aggressive. He's got that killer instinct. One of the reasons, or the main reason why I bet Corey Sandhagen last weekend against Marlon Vera, was because Vera has got a kick-based style of striking. Marlon Vera's boxing is very bad. And so we knew that Vera wouldn't have a whole lot of success against Sandhagen when it came to striking. What's interesting about this fight is that I do think Yanez is a much better boxer than Marlon Vera. I do not rate Vera's boxing at all. Kicking game's decent, but Vera's hands are not good. Yanez's boxing is absolutely brilliant. Yanez is probably one of the best boxers in the division. So even though, from a technical point of view, Font is probably better than Yanez everywhere, how easily Font was getting rocked and wobbled and dropped against Marlon Vera is a huge red flag, because Yanez is a far more dangerous boxer than Vera. I don't want to take nothing away from Vera. Vera's got a great kicking game, nasty elbows, he's dangerous in the clinch, crazy flying knees, crazy spinning attacks, very nasty kicking game. But in terms of pure boxing, Vera's boxing isn't good. Yanez's is. So I'm looking at that Vera Font fight, I'm thinking to myself, with the amount of success Vera had in hurting Font on the feet, with Yanez having that killer instinct and much better boxing than Vera, he's probably going to be able to catch Font really bad on the feet and knock him down, or maybe knock him out as well. So this is one of those tricky situations where the better fighter from a technical point of view is the underdog, which is kind of crazy. But like I always say, if making money betting on MMA was as simple as just identifying who the more skilled fighter was, we'd all be millionaires, because it's extremely easy to look at footage of two fighters and determine who is the most skilled. we know that there are so many other factors that determine the outcome of an MMA fight. And this fight is a good example of that, because when you look at how they match up stylistically, Font probably is the better striker, probably is the better grappler. But it doesn't mean anything if Yanez knocks him out. And so this fight is very tricky from a betting point of view. This is one of those fights where I do think is dog or pass. You know, seeing Yanez get outstruck by Randy Costa, seeing Yanez get outstruck by Davy Grant, and knowing how much better of a striker Rob Font is than Davy Grant and Randy Costa makes it impossible for me to bet Yanez at favourite odds. You know, it just isn't a good deal. You know, it's not a good bet. You know, if you look at the implied probability on Yanez's odds, 65%, you'd have to cap Yanez at like 70% or greater to get any value there, which you just can't do. The guy got outstruck by Davy Grant, for Christ's sake. But at the same time, I don't feel great about betting Rob Font because, in my opinion, Yanez is a far more dangerous boxer, not striker, far more dangerous boxer than Marlon Vera. So if Marlon Vera was able to hurt Font bad on the feet, knock him down, wobble him multiple times, Yanez has got the same killer instinct as Vera, the same aggression, the same nasty streak. He could definitely do the same. So I do think this is a dog or pass fight. But because of how fragile Font looked against Vera and the stage of Font's career he's in, I do think it's very risky to bet Rob Font. I will not be doing it personally. Now, let's take a look at the over-under on this one. So, I would go for the under. I would go on fight doesn't go to decision, purely because we saw Font get dropped, rocked, wobbled, almost knocked out multiple times against Vera. He took a lot of damage against Vera. We know the older you get, the more damage you take, your chin gets worse. So Vera couldn't put him away, but maybe he damaged Font enough to the point where Font's chin is going to be totally shot now, with him being 36 years old in a couple of months, which is very old for a bantamweight. So there's that to bear in mind. And we know how dangerous and aggressive Yanez is on the feet. He really does go for the kill. So you know what? I know there are going to be a lot of people that like Yanez this weekend. I'd actually say if you like Yanez, it might be a better idea to bet on this fight not to go to a decision than to bet Yanez straight. Because you get better odds. And I think if Yanez does win, it's going to be inside the distance. Because he does go for the kill. And I think Rob Font is there for the taking. You know, you can look at Font's record and say, well, he's had 25 pro fights. And, he's never been KO'd. Right? But we see it time and time again with these guys like Kamaru Usman. Like Cody Garbrandt. Right, where when they're these young hungry bulls, they're not getting knocked out, they're not getting finished. But when Father Time starts to catch up on them, all of a sudden they start to get knocked out, finished, rocked, wobbled, dropped a lot. I think we could be seeing Font in that situation this weekend, where he just looked very fragile against Marlon Vera. So even though he's never been knocked out, it's the first time for everything. He's facing a very dangerous boxer in Adrian Yanez. So I do think it's more likely this ends inside the distance. Maybe that's my way of saying I kind of do lean towards Yanez in this fight, but Yanez's odds are obviously pretty steep. So in terms of the props on this one, most likely outcome is going to be Yanez to win by knockout or TKO, but the odds pretty steep on that, so I'll give that one a miss. In terms of other props, nothing I really like there, if I'm honest. Nothing I really like. I would give the props a miss. So now let's get into the next fight that I want to break down on this card, which is going to be Kevin Holland against Santiago Ponzinibbio. So, Kevin Holland, pretty big favourite in this matchup. Odds of 1.40, which is minus 250 for an implied probability of 71%. Santiago Ponzinibbio, odds of around 3.0. which is going to be plus 200 for an implied probability of 33%. So Kevin Holland is 30 years old, 6'3", with an 81-inch reach. Santiago Ponzinibbio, 36 years old, 6 foot tall, with a 73-inch reach. So you can see that Kevin Holland is a little bit taller than Ponzinibbio, but he has a massive 8-inch reach advantage, which is huge in MMA. And statistically speaking, the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time, 7-0, when there is that big of a reach advantage in a fight. So Holland with quite a big statistical advantage coming into this one. That reach advantage means he wins around 70% of the time. So Ponzinibbio's got a lot of work to do. Now, in the breakdown videos for this card, we've spoken a lot about anecdotal trends which can have a profound impact on the outcome of MMA fights. We've spoken about the fur coat trend and the diamond watch trend in the Pereira versus Izzy fight. We talked about how Masvidal looks to be on a very steep decline, how he's spoken about potentially retiring, and how he's looked kind of shot in his last couple of fights. We've also spoken about how there's early signs that Rob Font might also be on a very steep decline, and how it looked like Father Time hit him pretty hard in the Marlon Vera matchup. And those concepts that we've already discussed a lot in these breakdowns this week are going to be a big talking point in this breakdown as well. Because whereas with guys like Israel Adesanya and Rob Font, we've kind of speculated that Father Time might be catching up with them and they might be, starting to plateau or decline. I feel Ponzinibbio is very much in the same situation as Jorge Masvidal, where we have clear, irrefutable, undeniable evidence that he is on a very, very steep decline. Because Ponzinibbio was one of these guys that had a granite chin. He was one of these guys that could just come forward, take control of the centre of the octagon, apply relentless pressure to his opponents, and break them with his pressure and aggression. And he'd be able to absorb anything that his opponents threw at him and keep continuing to come forward to try and break them. But in his last few fights, he's looked increasingly more fragile. And when we broke down the matchup between Rob Font and Adrian Yanez, and I was talking about how Font looked kind of fragile against Vera, and for that reason I felt it was reasonably likely Yanez would win the fight by knockout. On paper that seems pretty unlikely, because in 25 pro fights Rob Font had never been knocked out. But in that breakdown I used the example of guys like Kamaru Usman or Cody Garbrandt, who had gone through their whole careers without it and never been knocked out, and then all of a sudden they start to get rocked a lot, wobbled a lot, dropped out of nowhere, knocked out, because Father Time starts to catch up on them. And Santiago Ponzinibbio is a very good example of that. If we look at his record, he's had 35 pro fights. And prior to getting knocked out against Li Jingliang back in January 2021, he'd only ever been knocked out once against Lorenz Larkin. And so before the Li Jingliang fight, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he'd only been knocked out once in 30 pro fights. Since 2021, he's been knocked out by Li Jingliang, and he's been wobbled multiple times against Alex Morono. So in Ponzinibbio, we have this guy who built a career off being tough as nails and having a granite chin, looked indestructible, to now being a guy that is getting rocked, wobbled, dropped in all his fights and looking very, very fragile. And so, just like we were saying, the statistics around age are very useful to determine the most likely outcome of fights like Yanez versus Font. They're also very useful here, because again, the age of both Holland and Ponzinibbio is in that sweet spot where at 30 years old, Holland is going to be making big improvements from fight to fight. He's in his prime. He's still tough. He's still durable. He's still fast. He's still athletic. Whereas at 36 years old, with 35 pro fights, Ponzinibbio is starting to look a little bit chinny, a little bit fragile, and he no longer has all those physical attributes, the physicality, the athleticism, the power, the chin, that helped him build such an incredible career. And so we know that statistically, the younger fighter wins around 65% of the time when there's a 6-year age gap in a fight. But that statistic also includes situations where a 32-year-old's fighting a 26-year-old, and the 32-year-old hasn't started to decline yet, and the 26-year-old is pretty green. So applying that statistic to a matchup like that doesn't mean much. I'd guess if you were using that statistic to determine how often the younger fighter wins when you've got a guy in their early 30s fighting a guy in their late 30s, the stat is actually far higher than 65% in favour of the younger guy. So we know Ponzinibbio has looked very fragile in his recent fights. We know he's not as dangerous as he used to be or as aggressive as he used to be. His reflexes are a little bit shot, which makes this a terrible stylistic matchup for him because Holland has got good footwork, good movement. He's a dangerous striker. He's durable. We saw him inflict a lot of damage on Stephen Thompson in his last fight. And the reach advantage for Holland is going to make it extremely difficult for Ponzinibbio to get inside and land when his reflexes are already shot and he's not as aggressive as he used to be. So with both these guys being primarily strikers, it's a terrible stylistic matchup for Ponzinibbio because Ponzinibbio is a lot more gun shy these days, and Holland should be able to bounce around, use his footwork and movement to chip away at Ponzinibbio from a safe distance, rack up big volume, and most likely knock Ponzinibbio out. The problem with Kevin Holland is that he has an enormous weakness that makes it impossible to ever bet him as a favourite. And of course I'm talking about his takedown defence and ground game. Holland is one of these guys that is very easy to take down, very easy to hold down, and more worryingly, when you do take Holland down and you put him on his back, he's very easy to hold down. At times he doesn't show any urgency to work his way back up to his feet, and he'll literally lie on his back for 2-3 minutes doing nothing. Now that's probably not going to cost him this weekend because Ponzinibbio very rarely tries to take his opponents down. The problem is, assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups, and just because Ponzinibbio has never really grappled that much in the past doesn't mean he won't in this fight. Especially if he realises early on that he's outgunned big time on the feet. If he can't get near Holland because of the reach and the footwork and the movement, he may be forced to grapple. Whereas in the past, when he hasn't been facing guys as long and tall and as difficult to get to as Holland, he's been happier to stand and bang with him, like with a guy like Morono, for example. And so, this is one of those fights where there's no way you can bet Ponzinibbio with how fragile he's looked in recent matchups. The age statistic, the size and reach of Holland, his footwork, his movement, his technique on the feet. It's going to be extremely difficult for Ponzinibbio to win a stand-up fight. And because he doesn't ever really grapple, we can't count on him to use a grappling heavy game plan either. But in order to get value on Holland, you've got to give him a better than 71% chance of winning, which is a very difficult thing to do with how bad his fight IQ is and how bad his takedown defense and ground game is. Just because Ponzinibbio doesn't usually grapple doesn't mean he won't this weekend. And this is one of those situations where, again, you've got to let the odds do the work for you. If Holland was closer to the even money odds range, I think it would be a fair risk to reward ratio to take on, in the sense that, we could say, Holland does have bad takedown defense, does have a bad ground game, but Ponzinibbio hardly ever grapples, so it's not something we need to worry about in this fight too much. And I think, betting Holland in the even money odds range still gives us a reasonable risk to reward ratio. We can't say that here simply because with Holland being such a big favourite, you just cannot afford to take on, any major risk factors at all, because you're only getting $40 profit back for every $100 you risk. So it's just a very bad risk to reward ratio. So this is one of those situations where I don't think it's dog or pass. I don't like Ponzinibbio enough in this fight to consider betting him, but at the same time I do think you'd have to be crazy to bet Holland is such a big favourite. Holland's not the kind of guy that I would trust in that odds range. So in terms of the fight to go to a decision, not to go to a decision, with how fragile Ponzinibbio has looked in recent fights, I would prefer to bet on fight doesn't go to a decision. We know Holland's a dangerous striker, and Ponzinibbio, doesn't look like he can take a shot anymore. Wobbled multiple times by Morono in his last fight. Having said that, Holland's fight IQ is bad. He does have a habit of playing with his food. He does dick about a lot. So I don't love the fight not to go to a decision. But if you really want to bet the over-under on this matchup, I do think in the even money odds range, fight not to go to a decision is the better option. I might bet it myself, purely based on the fact that, I think the crowd is going to be pretty lit in Miami. It's a big pay-per-view. Ponzinibbio loves to get into wars. Holland is a dangerous striker. That energy, the atmosphere in the arena could kind of bait these guys into going to war. And I think if these guys did go to a war, started getting into some big exchanges, I don't think Ponzinibbio would be able to take the kind of damage that Holland is going to be serving up. Holland is a lot more dangerous than Morono, and Morono almost knocked Ponzinibbio out 2-3 times in his last fight, and Morono didn't have the power, the technique, the footwork, the movement, the length, the range that Holland does. In terms of the prop bets for this one, Holland by knockout is the one that I would go for. The odds are pretty short, not particularly good odds on that, but I do think that's the most likely outcome. Now let's break down the final fight on this main card. My hair's gone all crazy. My hairdresser's on vacation. It's going to be a couple more weeks of the crazy fucking hair. It's a bit of a shame. But anyway, let's get into the next one. Paul Rosas Jr. versus Christian Rodriguez. So, if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Rosas is the favourite at average odds of around 1.42, which is going to be minus 238 for an implied probability of 70%. If we take a look at the odds on his opponent, Rodriguez, he's around an average of 3.0, which is going to be plus 200 for an implied probability of 33%. So Rosas is 18 years old, 5'9" with a 67-inch reach, and Rodriguez is 25 years old, 5'7" with a 71-inch reach. So some interesting X factors for us to dig into here. Starting off with the age. So, in other breakdown videos for this card, we've spoken about how there is a sweet spot for interpreting age statistics. And this is one of those examples where I think understanding what age statistics mean is particularly important. Because we can see that Rosas is 7 years younger than Christian Rodriguez, which statistically means Rosas will win 67% of the time, because the younger fighter wins around 67% of the time when there's a 7-year age gap in a fight. However, statistics are only as useful as the person interpreting them. And this is one of those rare examples where I actually think the advantage flips to being with the older fighter. Because when you're 18 years old, you're young, you're green, you're inexperienced, you haven't developed that grown man strength and physicality yet. There's no way at 18 years old you can be well-rounded and good at everything. You're going to have a lot of major weaknesses. Rosas has never been dropped in a fight, doesn't know what it's like to be really badly hurt in a fight and have to weather the storm and come back through it. Rosas never fought, with this much pressure on him. And I'm not saying Rodriguez ever fought with loads of pressure on him either, but what I am saying is Rodriguez is older, he's more experienced, he's had a lot more time to train. And so I feel whenever you've got a really young fighter facing a guy, mid-late 20s, early 30s, you've got to ignore the age stat, and the older guy probably does have an advantage based on experience alone. Now, both guys are roughly the same size. You can see the Rodriguez has got a 4-inch reach advantage. Rosas is a bit taller. Rosas has also got a big physicality advantage. He's a lot stronger, more physically imposing than Rodriguez. But nothing major in terms of size going on here. Now, this is a real interesting fight for me because again, it's kind of a handicapper's dream. I don't say this very often, but when we were breaking down the main event, we were saying, like, you know, as a handicapper, we've got the perfect tool to try and predict the outcome of this matchup between Pereira and Adesanya this weekend, because we already saw them fight 5 months ago. Usually, in order to try and predict the outcome of an MMA fight, we've got to watch the last few fights of Pereira, the last few fights of Izzy, work out how they match up stylistically. We don't need to do that this time around because we've already seen them fight 5 months ago. What's cool about the Rosas versus Rodriguez fight is that we've also seen Rodriguez face someone very recently with the exact same style as Raul Rosas, and that's Jonathan Pearce. We know Pearce is a strong, physically imposing grappler that spams takedowns relentlessly for 3 rounds, which is pretty much exactly what Raul Rosas is going to do. And on top of that, Pearce is also very bad on the feet. Very low level striker, very bad defensively. Now, we haven't seen a whole lot of Rosas' striking, but from what we have seen from Rosas' striking, he also looks quite bad defensively and pretty green on the feet. So what's cool about this matchup is the Jonathan Pearce-Christian Rodriguez fight gives us really good insight into how this fight is most likely to go. And from what I can see from their past matchups, Rodriguez should have a pretty big advantage on the feet. He moves better than Rosas. He's a lot more technical. Haven't seen a whole lot of Rosas' striking, but he does look very green, very bad defensively, pretty sloppy on the feet. Now, he'll probably get away with it because Rodriguez is more of a volume striker, doesn't appear to have too much power in his hands. He's not a particularly dangerous striker. But if Rodriguez can keep the fight standing, he should do pretty well. Now, on the ground is where this gets really, really interesting, because Rodriguez's takedown defense is not good. His ground game isn't great. So with how strong and physically imposing Rosas is, with how good Rosas' MMA grappling is, he will be able to get Rodriguez down. But what makes this an interesting fight is that Rodriguez is very tough, he's got very good cardio, and he's very scrambly on the ground. If we scroll down a bit, you can see that he has trained at Rufus Sport. And we know that a characteristic with Rufus Sport fighters is that their takedown offense does tend to be pretty bad. But on the ground, they are quite scrambly. They are good at defending themselves. And they are tricky and slippery. So this is one of those fights where I could definitely see Rodriguez giving Rosas hell. Because what you've got in a guy like Rosas is a strong, athletic, physically imposing guy with a lot of inexperience. So a lot of physical gifts, but perhaps not the experience to make the most of those physical gifts yet. So Rosas is likely going to have a lot of success with his grappling. But Rosas, because he's young and because he's green and because he's inexperienced, he does make a lot of mistakes on the ground. Does give up position a lot, does get reversed a lot, does give up cheap takedowns himself. And so even though he's the superior grappler to Christian Rodriguez, with Rodriguez having the advantage on the feet, with Rodriguez being quite scrambly on the ground, I think he can make this one interesting. It'll be a very interesting fight. It's very difficult to bet Rodriguez because we've seen him get taken down and controlled by Jonathan Pearce for long periods of time. And Rosas is certainly skilled enough to do that. However, Rosas is far too inexperienced and makes far too many mistakes on the ground to me to trust him as a big favourite. So for me, I won't be betting this fight. I'm going to pass on it. But if you want to bet this fight, it's definitely dog or pass. I would not be betting on a 18-year-old fighter who's very green at these odds. You know, in order to find value betting on guys in this odds range, they have to have virtually no risk factors at all. That's not the case with Rosas. Rodriguez is tough, he's game, he's scrappy, he's skilled, he's more experienced, he's got good cardio. I think he can turn this fight into a war. Test Rosas in ways Rosas has never been tested before and make it interesting. So for me, this is dog or pass. But it's it's one of those fights where is a bad stylistic matchup for Rodriguez in the sense that Pierce did give him hell on the ground, but at the same time he did a reasonably good job of defending himself, won some scrambles, hit some reversals. Pierce is a lot more experienced than Rosas. Perhaps Pierce will be able to bounce back from some of the things Rodriguez had success with, where Rosas would not be able to bounce back, right? If Rosas loses position, maybe he won't be able to get it back as fast as Pierce. If Rosas makes a mistake, perhaps he won't be able to recover like Pierce did. We will see. So in terms of the over-under on this one, I do think it's pretty likely this fight goes the distance. Both are very tough. I do see most of this fight taking place on the ground, just because Rodriguez's takedown offense is too bad to keep it standing. On the feet, I don't think Rosas is in much trouble because Rodriguez is more of a volume striker without too much power in his hands. On the ground, Rodriguez's submission defense is pretty good. I do think it's quite likely this fight goes to decision. I might actually bet that at dog odds. And in terms of the prop bets, Rosas by decision is alright actually. I quite like that. Rosas by decision at odds of 3.30 plus 230. I don't mind that. I'd probably take that as well. So I hope you found those breakdowns useful. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Please hit the like button if you haven't already. And check out my website, mabettingtips.com. Link in the description below. If you like these breakdown videos and you want to watch breakdown videos for all these prelim matchups, you can find them on my website, man. And hopefully you'll get a lot of use out of them. And they will provide you with a nice little strategy guide for your DraftKings teams or for betting the fights this weekend. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, everyone. Love you all. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.